So let's start at the very beginning. It's a very good place to start. In The Sound of Music, Julie Andrews sings this when she wants to teach the children the basics of music. Matthew is also saying this by starting with a genealogy. Let's start at the very beginning. It's a very good place to start. I don't know if you've noticed, but the word genealogy is very similar to the word Genesis, which means the beginning. It means I'm about to tell you a story. For us, it's the story of Jesus Christ, trying to answer the question, who is this Jesus? What does his story mean for me? And what kind of story exactly is this going to be? Who's going to be included in it? I found this in some of our materials. They know Matthew's, but they have Luke's genealogy in the book of Kells, and I just think it's beautiful. So it's in both of those Gospels, the two Gospels that tell the birth of Jesus. And apparently, according to the two of them, and specifically Matthew, it's a story of many generations, which is our theme for all of Advent. It actually comes out of Mary's song in the book of Luke, where she says, "His mercy is for those who fear him from generation to generation." We want to understand the person of Jesus, so we reflect and we study and we celebrate the history of his people. And so we learn that this is a Jewish story. This is a story about God's covenant that began all the way back to Abraham and David and even those who were exiled by the powers of Babylon. It's a story about men, old men like Abraham, and wise but often adulterous kings like David. About Sarah who laughed, Rahab, a crafty prostitute, and Tamar who saved the lineage through sheer trickery. As we heard, the list has good ones and ones that were not always so good. He was lying. The story will be more like a complicated tapestry of what being in relationship with God looks like. How they either participated in God's liberation and love or tried to thwart God's justice. Abraham and Sarah passed down the good news that you aren't stuck in your life. You can break away. You can start entirely new with God, and impossible blessings might come out of it. Rahab passes on that your past doesn't have to inhibit your ability to participate in liberation for your own family and for God's family. David passes on poetry and also the violence that power often imposes on women, and the profound effect of repentance. The genealogy reminds us that they pass on their imperfections and their deep faith. They remind us we don't have to be perfect to belong to God. But they're all essential parts of this story, of Jesus' story. Matthew includes them, and we read them and we study them because there is enough room in God's story for them, exactly the way they are. But Genesis and genealogy also suggest continuing life. It suggests what comes next. It suggests God's continuing and ongoing presence in God's people, in their midst. The way that people understood this in the Old Testament was often through successive generations. Abraham and Sarah lived on through Isaac, Isaac and Rebekah lived on through Jacob, David and Bathsheba through Solomon, etc. They continued because their descendants lived on. And one of the commentators I read explained a practice in the Korean community of they told their story and history in the ways that they named their children. It was often the paternal grandparents who did it, and they would take a part of their name and attach it to another part to create a new name, but it would include the history in it. And so this continuity would start to happen. And that resonated with me because, as some of you know, I named my daughter after my best friend with the same name, who passed away 13 years ago at the age of 29. We asked Brooke's mother, Mary Jane, for permission, and she agreed. But we chose a different middle name, so she is Brooke Genevieve, because she is entirely her own. And she carries an important piece of my history with her as well. The genealogies remind us that there is room enough for our past and our collective history in this story. The genealogy invites us to consider, what are we passing down to our children beyond our names? What are we passing down to our community as a congregation? How are we participating in God's story of liberation and love, and where are we thwarting it? And although this genealogy is a part of Jesus' story, his birth is not like any other, right? It's by Mary and by the Holy Spirit. He is directly from God, and he is born of woman. If we're paying attention, the story has taken a turn. God isn't just for us at this point, but came to be with us. A new way of life with God is about to be born. A new way to experience and understand the presence of God is about to happen. That's what we're preparing for. There is room enough for this new beginning, for this new story too. His birth can be seen as a new Genesis, as a new origin story. Something new is about to be born into this old story. And we should become familiar with these previous names in order to understand this new story, so that we will know how to make room for many, many stories as we start this season of Advent. This new story that Jesus brings, this new beginning, means that some people who thought there wasn't room for them, or were told they weren't wanted or needed, will hear a very different answer from Jesus. There is room. So the first question for us today is, where do you need God to make room in your life to be a part of this story? I think people come to church and they see us and they look at us and go, well, they look like they've got their stuff together. They know what they're doing. They have this faith thing down. But Linda's like, you know the truth. And sometimes we're the ones that think, but not me, right? Like, if God really knew what I had done or not done. I mean, what if I just stand on the edges? You know, we'll give that seat to somebody better, you know, someone who prays better than I do. You know, God doesn't really know what I'm like at home or with my family or my history or my past. If they knew, they wouldn't really want my story as a part of this story. My story is too complicated. I don't know if I have time to be part of this story. Or if God had wanted me, I would have heard by now, right? I'm one of those people with too many questions or too many doubts. God only wants really faithful people, right? Not only is there room, but this whole season is to remind us that Jesus came to make it perfectly clear on this. You are wanted. You are needed. You are essential to this story. You make the story richer. You make the story more real and more authentic. You make it vulnerable. Just like those people who came before him, none of whom were perfect. But what they did show is an example of what not perfect people can do with the help of God. How each of them helped pass on the story of God's love and God's liberation and God's justice. So the first thing we do is we embrace that there is room for ourselves in the story. And the second question is, Who else do we know that needs to hear that there's room for them in this story? How do we live and act in ways that show them that not only can they just join us for worship on Sunday, but that we will work and fight and speak up for them to join us fully and completely as they are into this story? That we stand with them and for them, because we know they're being persecuted. Literally, whole communities are being targeted. And not just by words, but by crimes, being told there are people that don't even want to let them exist, let alone believe that they are a valuable and essential part of Jesus' story. That violence is telling a story, and often using the Jesus story incorrectly. Our story is directly opposed to that. Our story is about liberation and light and love and enough room for everyone's story. It takes courage to enter this story, to tell such a radical story, to defend and publicly stand up for this story. To do as the prophets tell us, to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God's story that has lasted from generation to generation to generation. And how do we know it's possible? How do we know that courage exists? Because of those people whose stories we read, who despite their fear, despite their uncertainty or doubts about their own worth, spoke up and out on behalf of God. They overcame the odds of their gender, their culture, their family situation, and they made room for themselves in God's story. Moses stood up to Pharaoh. David thwarted a giant. Ruth endured great loss and still imagined and experienced new life. Solomon built a great temple. And many of the names that we don't know tried their best to find their place in God's story on behalf of God's people. It is about claiming our own place and inviting others to find theirs. It's believing that when we join the story, when we invite others to join the story, we can transform the world. And transform it in the ways that Isaiah has promised us, that we can turn weapons of war into tools to create gardens. We won't destroy, we will grow. We will nourish, we will flourish. We will show them the light. This first Sunday of Advent is all about that hope. As we do every year, we light candles in the darkest season of the year, and we read these stories, and we focus on the light. As Sarah Bessey, a Christian author, explains it like this: I want to be a part of a people who see the darkness, know it's real, and then light a candle anyway. And hold that candle up against the wind and pass along our light wherever it's needed, from our own homes to the halls of legislation, to the church pulpit, to the kitchens of the world. I want to be a part of those people. Every year we get to find our place in this story and remember that there is room for us here too. That we are essential and necessary for the story because God has given each and every one of us spiritual gifts that are meant to be shared, to be given away. Each and every one of us have experiences and stories of being carried by God across the struggles, across the loneliness, across the pain. We have stories of miracles, of things we can't explain, of healings, of gifts of abundance, of the right people being there at the right moment. We have our own individual stories of our relationships with God that include our successes and our failures, our joys and our disappointments, our faith and our doubt. It includes the times we did or did not show up for Bible study, the times we did or did not pray, the times we did or did not fall asleep during sermon. But the stories when all we had to stand on was faith, and we discovered it was enough. We need all of those stories. Because we are also people who have inherited the story of God's love and liberation, and God's justice for the world. And as Christine Hong, an assistant professor, says, you have inherited what cannot be stolen by empire. Because all can taste and feel God's justice, mercy, and love. You have inherited what cannot be stolen. But we have been given less from generation to generation. Despite there being no room for the Christ child, the Christ child has made room for each and every one of us. I invite you to take a moment, if you feel comfortable. Close your eyes. We have a poem for reflection about this idea of room from Reverend Sarah Sweet. So take a breath. She said, I asked God, what about my fingernail biting habit? Or the way I leave all the cabinets open in the kitchen? What about the way I can be dramatic, drumming up a fight only to hand out apologies like souvenirs? What about the way I second guess myself, let shame drive, or stay quiet when I have something to say? What about the ways I chase accomplishments like a dog with a bone? What about the doubt? The fact that I'm terrible at prayer and cannot help but yawn during church. What about? My baggage might be too big for the van. But then, God called me by my first and middle name, which always means business, and said, who told you you were too much? Sugar, there's so much room for you here. So that's when I grabbed a seat and we hit the road, and I knew right then that the rumor was true. There is room. There is room. There is room